Sit back, relax, and get cozy as I tell you the tale called Ashwing Rises. The hills east of Duskmoor were quiet in the mornings, not peaceful. There hadn't been peace in Verethorn in decades, but quiet in a way that made you listen harder, as though the land itself was waiting for something or someone. I sat beside the fire, brushing the ash from our breakfast pot, while Sir Aldric of Duskmoor sat nearby, sharpening his blade with long, methodical strokes. Each rasp of the whetstone against the steel sounded like a whisper through the mist. He didn't speak much on mornings like this, and I didn't press him. We were days from Black Spire Keep, posted at an outland field camp, meant to serve as a supply relay. Small, quiet, away from the real siege lines. The kind of camp where days passed slowly, duties were menial, and the air wasn't yet choked with smoke and spells. The land around us was hilled and scattered with trees, the leaves just beginning to turn from late summer's green to the brittle reds and golds of a Verethorn autumn. Our tents, pale canvas and frayed at the seams, were pitched in a half circle against a rocky bluff that shielded us from the winds coming off the northern passes. Most of the men in the camp were new conscripts, boys with more pride than scars. They passed the hours, boasting of imagined glories, and daring each other to draw steel against empty air. They hadn't seen real battle yet, not like Sir Aldric had, not like I had. I'd seen what Melgor's undead legions had done to the valley towns. I'd helped carry broken bodies from the rubble. That sort of truth settles into your bones. It stops you from laughing too loud when someone mentions the enemy's name. Still, the mood in camp was light that morning. We'd heard through the mage circuits that the siege at Blackspire was going well. The High King's forces had breached the first outer wall. The necromancer's ranks were withering under sunsteel bombardment and blessed arrows. Everyone said the end was coming soon. Victory was near. That's what they said. I remember Aldric pausing mid-stroke, looking toward the ridge as if he'd heard something I hadn't. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing, just mist curling between the trees and the far-off glint of morning dew on stone. "What is it?" I asked. "Ravens," he said. It took me a moment to spot it. Dark wings cutting across the sky from the west, flying low and fast. Not one, but two. One peeled off toward the main road, but the other dipped lower, heading directly for our camp. A few of the men rose to their feet as the raven spiraled down, wings stiff, claws wide. It landed atop the standard post, just outside the captain's tent, and let out a single sharp cry. The scroll it carried was sealed in black wax. That alone was enough to steal the laughter from the morning. I stood slowly. Aldric had already risen, dusting his cloak, and striding toward the captain's tent with purpose. I followed close behind. Inside, Captain Merith was already unsealing the scroll, her jaw tight as the wax snapped beneath her fingers. A few other officers crowded around the map table, murmuring to each other in uncertain tones. Aldric stepped beside her from Blackspire. Merith gave a grim nod. She unrolled the parchment fully and laid it flat on the table. The writing was jagged, hastily written. Magical residue still clung to the ink. Scriborn, not penned by hand. I read over her shoulder. The message was short, direct. Melgor has awakened something beneath the keep. Not a spell, not a summon. A binding, broken. The black flame stirs. The siege must stop. Retreat. Destroy the roads. He is calling the Hollow One. The old fire walks again. My blood went cold. I looked at Aldric. His face had not changed, only his eyes. "The Hollow One," he said softly. "Gods help us." Captain Merith spoke with forced calm. "Is this credible?" Aldric didn't hesitate. "Yes, But what is it? One of the younger knights asked. What does it mean? I answered, before I realized I was speaking. Melgor's name is taken. I said, Melgor the Hollow. It isn't just a title, it's a pact. The table went quiet. I swallowed, recalling the old lore, the kind whispered behind temple doors and burned from public records. Long before Melgor, there was another, an entity that dwelled beneath the mountains, a shadow that fed on fire, magic, death. Till the last of the fireborn fell, they bound it beneath Black Spire and sealed the mountain. It was forgotten, buried. Melgor must have found the old rites. Mareth looked to Aldrich. If this is true, he means to unleash something worse than himself. Aldrich said, something none of us are prepared for. Silence fell again. Then Mareth spoke quickly. We must send riders to the siege lines. A warning, if this thing wakes. The mages say it's already stirring. I interrupted. The words hung heavy. Aldrich turned to me. Calum, saddle both horses. Prepare enough supplies for 3 days. Light, we'll leave within the hour. I blinked. He met my eyes. If that thing rises, it'll come through the pass near Verathorn's eastern line. The closest detachment to that position is the 6th. Your brother is still stationed there, is he not? I nodded. Then we ride to them. Now, before this becomes more than a siege. No one argued. There was no time. The black flame had begun to stir. The sky had gone quiet after the raven came, as if the clouds themselves had stopped to listen. Gone was the chatter from the soldiers tending fires, or the laughter of green squires comparing scars they didn't have. The stillness had weight now. Sir Aldrich stood beside Captain Mareth at the war table while I lingered a pace behind, pretending not to read the scroll that had uncoiled itself like a coiled snake across the worn parchment maps. But the words were etched clearly enough that I couldn't help but see them. I didn't want to, but they burned into me just the same. Ashwing. The name shouldn't have meant anything to me. I had never seen a dragon, only heard the old tales told around campfires in the north. But I knew the stories, the ones about the Age of Fire, when the sky burned and the ground cracked, when cities vanished in a single night beneath wings of flame. Ashwing was said to have been the last, slain by 3 kings and sealed under the mountains with spells that took 100 mages to bind. And now Melgor had woken it. Captain Mareth's voice was low and clipped. If this is true, we need to reach Black Spire by nightfall. We cannot hold the siege line. If that thing arrives, we won't, Aldrich said. His tone was calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw. We'll send no bird. The message won't reach them in time. Even with spell flight, we ride. The 2 of you? She asked. Aldrich nodded. 2 riders can move faster than a company. We'll take the runestone. If they don't heed it, nothing will. Mareth opened a lacquered case near the table and withdrew the decree. It was smaller than I expected, just a thick, smooth stone, jet black, carved in ancient Varathic runes. It pulsed faintly with contained magic, sealed with the king's sigil in molten silver. She passed it to Aldrich, and he wrapped it in dark cloth before placing it carefully in a pouch on his saddle belt. Straight through the Highland passes will be too slow, Mareth said. The only chance is through the old land. Aldrich didn't hesitate. The Dreadwood. I felt my chest tighten. The name was all I needed. Everyone knew it. The old forest where sunlight didn't reach, and maps turned false. It was the kind of place you walked around, even if it meant 3 days more on the road. Captain Mareth nodded grimly. From there, the Mistfun swamp, then across the forgotten mines of Myrnos. If you keep your pace, you can reach Black Spire by dawn. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. It was one thing to hear we'd ride, it was another to know where, through the dark places, the ones people whispered about when fires burned low. Aldrich turned to me. You'll carry the extra provisions, light, one bedroll, no tent. If we stop, it will not be for long. I nodded and left the tent, still feeling the silence inside clinging to me like cobwebs. Our horses were already being brought around by the handlers. I took the packs and checked the straps, hands working more from habit than thought. I moved without looking at anyone. I didn't want to meet their eyes. Not while they still believed the siege was the final battle. Not while they still thought victory was near. I looked toward the west, where the tree line rose like a wall of shadow in the distance. The dreadwood, even from here, it looked unnatural. The trees were too dense, too tall, their canopies forming a jagged outline against the gray sky. No birds flew over it, no wind passed through. It was as if the forest had drawn a line and dared the world to cross it. Aldrich joined me as I finished securing the last strap. He placed one gloved hand on my shoulder. Are you ready? I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. We mounted and turned toward the edge of camp. The path west was narrow, a trail long forgotten by most maps, but the scouts still used it when they had to, skirting its edge but never stepping in. It would lead us to the mouth of the dreadwood, where the shadows swallowed the hills. As we rode, the soldiers turned to watch us go. Some raised hands in salute, others only stared. They didn't know what we carried. They didn't need to. We left the camp behind just as the wind began to stir, and far off, I thought I heard something like thunder roll across the mountains, but the sky was clear, and the sound came from the direction of Black Spire. The air changed the moment we passed under the first tree. It wasn't a sudden shift, not a gust or a chill. It was quieter than that, a kind of stillness that fell over everything. Not silence exactly, but something heavier, the sound of the world holding its breath. The trees were tall and dark, their bark rough and blackened like old charcoal. Moss hung in long strands from the branches, swaying slightly even though no wind moved. The trail beneath our horses narrowed with every step until it wasn't a trail at all, just earth that remembered where footsteps once passed. The light dimmed quickly, not from the canopy alone, though that was thick enough to choke the sun. It was like the color had bled from the world. Everything faded to gray and green, shadows stretching in ways they shouldn't. Sir Aldrich rode ahead, one hand always near his blade, his posture tense. He said nothing. Neither did I. Words felt wrong here, like they'd echo too loud and bring attention we didn't want. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel things at the edge of my vision, not shapes exactly, just movement. The brush shifting where there was no breeze, the sense that branches bent closer when we passed, then pulled away again when we looked. Once, I heard laughter, high, distant, childlike. It came from behind us, then from the left, then it was gone. Our horses snorted and stamped. Mine grew more restless with each hour. She jerked at the reins when we passed a tree whose bark was carved in deep spiral patterns, the grooves filled with something dark and wet. I tried not to look too closely. We passed stone markers crumbled into ruin. Some bore the old runes of Myrnos, half swallowed by vines. Others were broken statues, their faces worn smooth, but their eyes still visible, as if they'd been spared the years just to keep watching. We didn't stop, we didn't rest. By midday, or what I guessed was midday, fog began to rise from the ground. It clung low and thick, making every step feel uncertain. I lost sight of the path, then I realized there had never really been one. The horses slowed. Aldrich dismounted first and gestured for me to do the same. We led them forward, boots sinking into the mossy ground, every footfall a soft hush. He held up a hand. I froze. There was something ahead. Not sound, not movement, just a feeling. And then it came. They slipped from the trees in silence. 4 of them, maybe 5. I couldn't tell at first where one ended and another began. Their bodies were wrong, built of bark and bone, wrapped in cords of black sinew that gleamed wetly in the low light. They had the shape of hounds, but their eyes were hollow, and their jaws split wider than any beast I had ever seen. They didn't growl, didn't snarl, they just moved forward with long deliberate steps, their heads low, like wolves stalking prey. Aldrich stepped in front of me, drawing Dawnbinder with a sound that barely whispered. The sword glimmered faintly in the gloom, its edge gleaming with enchantment from the old forges. Shadow hounds, he muttered, born of the forest, tied to the hollow. The lead beast lunged. Aldrich moved like lightning, blade slashing upward to meet the thing's throat. Bark and bone shattered, and the hound fell in pieces, vanishing into black smoke as it hit the ground. Another came from the side, then 2 more. I stumbled back as Aldrich turned and struck again, cleaving one cleanly down the spine. But the others were faster. They darted in and out, not attacking directly, circling, watching, waiting. One caught Aldrich's side with a swipe of a clawed limb. His armor held, but I saw him stumble, just for a breath. The light faded further. The fog thickened. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. My blade was in my hand, but it felt useless. These weren't things you could fight the normal way. Not for long. One of the hounds stepped toward me, slowly, head cocked to the side. Its ribs were open, hollow like a cage, and inside something moved, shadows shifting in time with its breath. I didn't think. I reached for the pendant around my neck, the one given to all squires in Duskmoor when they first swore the oath. In its center was a single shard of white crystal. I'd only ever practiced the spell once, barely. It was a fragment of a light ward, meant for finding paths in the dark. It wasn't made for this, but I closed my hand around it and whispered the words anyway. Light, remember me. Light, return. The crystal warmed, then flared. A pulse of white light burst outward from my palm, not bright enough to blind, but sharp, clear, real. The hound nearest me recoiled with a hiss that wasn't a sound but a feeling, pain and rage, and something colder. The others faltered. One screamed, though it had no mouth. Aldrich struck again, while they staggered. Another hound dissolved into smoke. Then they scattered, not with the panic of beaten beasts, but with the eerie calm of something that had tested its prey and found it not yet ready to die. I fell to one knee, breath catching, the crystal still hot in my hand. My fingers trembled. Aldrich stood over me, blood trailing from his side, not deep, but enough to leave a mark. He didn't speak, just looked at the trees behind us. The path we had followed was gone, not hidden, gone. Where the trail had been, there was now only thick forest. The roots had shifted, the branches leaned inward, the trees had closed behind us, like a door. I rose slowly, sheathing my blade. We can't turn back, I said. Aldrich nodded. No, he said, we go forward now. And so we did. The mission had truly begun. Misfen Swamp did not begin with a clear line. There was no signpost or landmark that told us we'd crossed into it. One moment we were walking through the thinning edge of the Dreadwood, where the trees stood further apart, and the canopy let in something that resembled light. Then the roots began to vanish beneath shallow pools, and the ground softened to mud that pulled at our boots. The trees changed too. Their bark turned pale and smooth, their limbs long and weeping. Willows mostly, though none like the ones I'd seen in the northern groves of Duskmoor. These leaned in on themselves, like they were listening to secrets whispered through the water. Some had bones tangled in their roots, others bled sap that shimmered violet in the dimness. The mist rose early and never left. It came in curls and veils, drifting between the trees, dragging low over the water, turning every island of dry land into a fading memory of something solid. I could barely see 10 paces ahead at times. The sky above was gone, hidden behind a ceiling of cloud and fog that pressed closer by the hour. Sir Aldrich said nothing as we moved. He hadn't spoken since the fight with the shadow hounds. His wound was worse than he let on. The gash in his side had turned angry red, and his steps had grown slower, heavier. Each time he shifted in the saddle, I saw him wince. Though he masked it well, I kept watch while he slept. That first night, we had found a patch of solid earth, raised just high enough to keep the water from swallowing us. The fire I managed to light burned weak and blue, as if the swamp drank the heat as soon as it was born. I heard noises in the dark, laughter again, or something close to it. It never got near, but it never left, either. By morning, Aldrich's fever had set in. His skin was clammy, and he barely drank from the water pouch I handed him. I saw the glint of pain in his eyes when he looked toward the horizon. He knew as well as I did that the pace was killing us. We didn't have time for slower, so I led. The path, or what passed for one, twisted without reason. One moment we were headed west, then suddenly the trees bent around and the moss grew thick, only on the north sides again, as though we'd turned without knowing. I tried to follow the flow of the water beneath us, remembering Aldrich's lessons about swamp paths and the way channels always ran away from the deeper basins. But here, even the water didn't seem to agree with itself. There were shapes in the mist. I saw them often, not clearly, never enough to say what they were, but they moved in ways that didn't match the trees, or the wind, or anything alive. Tall and slow, like they were gliding, and always just out of reach. Aldrich muttered in his sleep that night. His voice was cracked, dry. Sometimes it was names, ones I didn't know. Sometimes it was the same name, over and over. Calum, not mine. Someone else. The mist grew worse after that. It thickened like breath against a mirror. I lost sight of Aldrich once when he stopped to rest against a leaning stump, and when I turned back he was gone, just gone. I called for him. Nothing answered. I spun, searching, and every direction looked the same. Trees too close, water too still. The only sound was my own breathing. Then I heard the voice. It was soft, sweet, not a whisper, not this time. Clearer than that. It spoke my name, not with menace, but with warmth. Calum. I turned. The mist had parted slightly, and I saw her standing there. She was tall, her form wrapped in grey robes that shifted like silk underwater. Her hair hung in dripping strands over her face, and her arms were long, longer than they should have been. She held them open, like a mother welcoming a child. I stepped back, but something pulled at me. Not her hands, but her presence. A pressure in my chest, a tug in the back of my mind that said it would be so much easier if I just listened. I saw flashes, visions. My brother, Iran, laughing around a fire. My father, before the sickness took him. My mother's hands on my shoulder. I smelled bread baking. Then I saw myself, lying still, in the swamp water, eyes open. The pull grew stronger. I clenched my jaw, trying to think, trying to move, but my body wouldn't listen. My thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. And then I remembered Aldrich's voice. Not the real one, the one I heard every day in training, during marches, in the way he told stories by the fire when he thought I was asleep, the way he said my name. He had always anchored me, taught me how to hold fast in the storm. So I spoke his name, out loud. Sir Aldrich of Duskmoor. The mist shuddered. The figure tilted her head. I said it again. Sir Aldrich of Duskmoor, Knight of the Iron Sigil. The fog screamed. Not a sound I heard with my ears, but one that filled my bones. The figure collapsed inward, folding in on herself like smoke in reverse. Then she was gone. I stumbled forward, and there he was, leaning against the tree, eyes open, breathing shallow but steady. We didn't speak. I helped him up. We kept moving. The swamp changed after that. The trees grew further apart. The water deepened but cleared in places, showing strange stones beneath the surface, some carved, some natural, none safe. The ground began to rumble beneath our boots, just a little, at first, a soft vibration, like a beast turning in its sleep, beneath the earth. I looked up once, and the mist had shifted enough to show the edge of the sky. It was darker now, tinged red at the edges. Time was burning, and the thing Malgor had woken was moving. We needed to be faster. The land rose slowly after we left the mistfen, the wet earth giving way to harder stone and shallow ravines where broken roots clawed out of the walls like the fingers of buried giants. The mists followed us for hours, reluctant to loosen their grip, but at last they began to thin, and the sky returned in pale wintry patches between jagged cliffs. The silence here was different from the swamp, cleaner, older. We were entering the edges of the forgotten mines, and even without seeing the old stonework, I could feel it. The very air was heavier with history, layered, settled, unmoved by the world outside. We found the entrance tucked into the side of a slope, half choked by rubble and overgrown with sharp-veined ivy. The keystone above the broken arch still bore the symbol of Myrnos, a hammer split down the middle, its two halves turned away from each other, a sign of shame, a kingdom that had torn itself apart from within. Sir Aldrich dismounted slowly, his breath ragged. He'd stopped trying to hide how much the fever had taken from him. His skin was pale, his lips dry, and every movement cost him. Still, he reached for the sword at his back and drew it with care, as if greeting an old friend. "I'll take point," he said. "You stay close. If the tunnels haven't caved completely, we can cut nearly a full day off the ride to Blackspire, so we could go around," I said, already knowing the answer. "We can't," he said. "You heard the ground. The beast stirs, and the army doesn't know." We lit the torches and stepped inside. The tunnels were colder than I expected. Not just the chill of deep stone, but something more settled, as if the cold had been here so long it no longer noticed itself. Our footsteps echoed off the carved walls, each one sending little shivers through the dust. The stone was etched with age-worn runes, and patterns that bent with the shape of the rock. No straight lines, not anymore. It didn't take long before the path forked. The main tunnel had long since collapsed in a heap of jagged rubble, but a smaller side shaft opened to our right, lower ceiling, narrower walls, and an iron gate half hanging from one hinge. We passed through it carefully, ducking beneath a fallen beam. The air was thick with old dust and rusted metal, and the further we went, the more I felt it in my chest, pressure building behind the lungs, a slow grinding tension that didn't belong to fear, but to memory. These tunnels remembered pain. We passed storage rooms, full of collapsed crates, broken tools, the rusted bones of machines whose purpose I couldn't guess. Dwarven statues stood at intervals, some cracked in half, others headless, but all bearing the same expression, not pride or defiance, but deep, wordless sorrow. It clung to them like moss. We moved deeper, our torchlight casting long shadows on the walls. The light didn't feel welcome here. It showed too much. Aldrich stopped suddenly, his head tilted. "You hear that?" he whispered. At first I heard nothing. Then, faint, far off, the sound of metal scraping against stone. We pressed forward, slower now, more careful. My hand rested on the hilt of my blade, but I didn't draw it. Not yet. We crossed a narrow bridge of stone that spanned a deep chasm. Far below I saw no bottom, just the flicker of torchlight on what might have been old veins of silver or something darker, pulsing faintly with their own glow. A stairwell spiraled up from the far side, half collapsed, but passable. At the top, we found them, 3 figures, unmoving, standing in the middle of the corridor, like they'd been waiting. Their armor was dwarven, but warped, helms fused to skulls, chest plates melted into rib cages, gauntlets etched with runes that flickered faintly when we drew near. Their skin, if it could be called that, was stone and ash, their eyes hollow sockets lit with pale fire. Stone-born, cursed remnants of Myrnos. Dwarves who had once sworn to defend their kingdom to the death, and who had never been released from that vow. Aldrich raised his sword slowly. "Don't run," he said. One of the stone-born took a step forward, and the others followed. Their movement was slow, grinding, like boulders shifting under their own weight, but there was no hesitation in them. They were not guarding this place, they were hunting. Aldrich struck first, his blade catching the first revenant at the shoulder. It cracked stone, sent shards flying, but the thing didn't fall. It only turned its head, as if puzzled, and swung its hammer-like arm toward Aldrich's ribs. He blocked, staggered, struck again. I moved to his side, blade drawn, heart hammering. I ducked beneath a backhanded blow, slashing at a leg joint, but my sword barely bit. It was like cutting granite with a kitchen knife. Another revenant raised its axe. Aldrich parried, but not in time. The blade caught his thigh, and he dropped to one knee with a grunt. I screamed something. His name, I think, but he only looked at me, eyes clear through the pain. "You have to go," he said. "I won't leave you. You must." He pushed himself upright, blood running down his leg now, staining the stone beneath us. "Your oath," he said, voice low but firm. "It was not to follow me. It was to serve the realm." The revenants advanced again, but looked past them, to a narrow stairwell just visible behind a fallen column. A way out. Aldrich saw where I was looking, and nodded once. Then he turned back to the stone-born, and raised his sword again. "Run, Calum." I ran. I didn't want to. Every step felt like betrayal, but I ran, ducking beneath the shattered arch, past the ruins of the stairwell, torch held high, breath ragged. Behind me, I heard the clash of steel on stone, the roar of a dying night, the shattering scream of something ancient and angry. Then silence. The tunnels closed around me, and the path sloped upward again. I didn't stop, not until my legs gave out hours later, and I collapsed against a cold stone wall in a tunnel that opened to a crack of daylight high above. I sat there for a long time, torch guttering beside me, the runestone decree heavy in my pouch. Sir Aldrich was gone. The mission was mine now, and I would not fail him. The darkness had changed since Aldrich fell. Before, it had been a shared silence between us. Dangerous, yes, but bearable with his presence. Now it pressed against me, like a second skin. Thicker, heavier. Each breath felt too loud. Each step echoed like a betrayal. I moved through the tunnels, with the runestone clutched tightly beneath my cloak, the torch in my hand burning lower by the hour. The path twisted without pattern, descending for a time, then climbing back into the heart of the mountain. Every hole looked the same, carved stone worn smooth by time, walls cracked from long-forgotten quakes, beams of rusted iron, holding ceilings that no longer trusted themselves to stay aloft. Hunger crept in slowly, like the dark. I hadn't eaten since the morning before Aldrich died, and that had only been a strip of dried meat, and a swallow of water. My stomach had stopped growling. Now it just ached, dull and deep. My mouth was dry, and when I spoke to myself, just to hear a voice, it came out hoarse and quiet. Worse was the doubt. It curled behind my thoughts like a viper waiting to strike. What if I was too late already? What if Black Spire had fallen? Or worse, what if no one believed me when I arrived? A squire, alone, carrying a message carved into stone and sorrow. Who would listen? I stumbled in the dark and caught myself against a wall. My hand landed on something slick, lichen, maybe, or the remnant of some deeper growth, and I yanked it back with a shudder. The torch flickered again. I kept moving. The path narrowed as I climbed, the floor shifting from smooth tiles to uneven stone. I passed the remains of old carts, their wheels shattered, their contents long since picked clean by time and decay. Tools lay where they'd been dropped, helmets, bones. I tried not to think about what might have chased the miners away. Hours passed, or maybe it was longer. Time moved strangely here, too deeply buried beneath the world to matter. Then the quake hit. It was small at first, just a tremble beneath my feet, like the mountain exhaling. Then the ground lurched sideways with a thunderous crack, and part of the ceiling ahead collapsed in a roar of stone and dust. I fell to the floor, hands over my head, torch rolling into the darkness. When the rumble stopped, I lifted my head slowly. The passage ahead was blocked by rubble, stone piled high and thick, sealed like a wall. The way back had vanished into dust. Behind me, another section of ceiling had fallen. I was trapped. Panic swelled in my chest, rising so quickly, I almost choked on it. I staggered to my feet, eyes scanning the ruined passage. My torch still burned, but dim now, its oil nearly gone. I crawled over the first layer of debris, coughing on the dust, and found a crack, barely wide enough to squeeze through. A fissure in the stone, narrow and dark, stretching into blackness. I had no idea where it led, but it was the only way. I took a breath and pushed the torch into the gap ahead of me, then slid in after it. The walls closed around me immediately, rough stone pressing on either side. I had to twist my shoulders to fit, and even then, I could barely move. Every breath felt like it scraped my lungs. The stone tore at my cloak, at my skin. My elbows bled. I dropped the torch once, and nearly couldn't reach it again. At one point, the passage dipped sharply, and I slid for several feet before catching myself on a ledge. The torch flared as it struck the wall, sputtering. Still, I crawled forward. I don't know how long I was in that crack. Time didn't exist there. Only stone and breath, and the weight of the mountain pressing down from all sides. I thought of Aldrich, of his final words, of how steady his hand had been, even as the Stoneborn closed in. Your oath was not to follow me. It was to serve the realm. I kept moving. At last, the fissure widened, just a little, enough for me to pull myself free and collapse onto a sloped tunnel floor, gasping. The torch had almost died. I held it close, sheltering the flame as I pushed myself to my feet. The air here was different, cleaner, faintly damp, like the promise of wind. I moved faster, stumbling through the last curve of the passage. The torch burned out completely, but I kept going, fingers scraping against the wall, until at last the tunnel opened, and I stepped into daylight. It blinded me at first, the sudden brilliance of it. After so long underground, I raised a hand against the sun and blinked until my vision returned. The world had changed. I stood on the side of a steep hill, rocky and overgrown, the grass stiff with autumn frost. The sky above was streaked with cloud, low and heavy, tinged with the faintest red. Far in the distance, across a broken valley, rose the towers of Black Spire. The fortress was as I remembered from old maps and whispered stories, its spires sharp as spears, its walls black stone, mottled with age and fire. The outer siege lines curled around it like a tightened noose, and even from here I could see the tents and siege engines clustered at the base of the cliffs. The army was still there. I had made it. A weight lifted from my chest, only to be replaced with another heavier one, because above the fortress, in the clouds beyond, I saw the silhouette. It moved slowly, circling, wings wide enough to darken the land below. Its shape was impossible to miss. Not a bird, not a wyvern, something older, more vast, the dragon, Ashwing. Its shadow passed over the clouds like a scar drawn by fire, and though it had not yet descended, though it had not yet roared or burned, I could feel its gaze, distant and unblinking. The sky trembled in its wake. I staggered forward a few steps, clutching the pouch at my side. The roan stone was still there, the king's command, the warning, the only chance we had left. There was no more time. The sky had darkened, the beast had risen, and I was the only one who could stop it. I don't remember climbing down the slope. My body moved without instruction, every limb aching, every step poured from some hidden reserve that should have run dry days ago. My legs shook with each descent. My palms were raw from gripping stone and clawing at earth. But Black Spire loomed ahead, and that was all that mattered. The siege encampment spread wide at the base of the cliffs, like a sleeping beast. Rows of tents sat heavy with dew, their canvas stained with ash and sun. Towers of siegewood bristled with sharpened bolts, and catapults stood like hunched giants waiting to wake. Men moved slowly through the outer lines, soldiers in rust-streaked armor, engineers, runners, a few wide-eyed apprentices with spell-inked gloves. They were calm. They believed the end was near. I stumbled through their ranks, barely able to hold my own weight. Dirt streaked my face. My cloak hung in tatters. My boots had split at the seams. I was thinner than I remembered, lighter in ways that had nothing to do with hunger. No one stopped me at first. No one noticed. But then a pair of guards at the second checkpoint stepped forward, lowering spears. Their armor bore the sigil of the Western host, 3 swords crossing beneath a burning sun. "Halt," one of them barked. "Identify yourself." I opened my mouth, but the words tangled in my throat. My tongue was thick and dry. I tried again. "Squire Calum," I rasped. "Under Sir Aldrich of Duskmoor, I carry orders. From the king." The taller guard frowned. "Sir Aldrich hasn't ridden this far south." "He has," I said. "He fell in the mines of Myrnos." The second guard's grip on his spear tightened. "Then how did you get here?" I reached beneath my cloak and drew the pouch close to my chest. My hands shook as I pulled the runestone free and unwrapped it. The black stone gleamed with a quiet, living light. Veins of silver moved slowly across its surface, shifting with the breath of enchantment. At its center, the sigil of the king was etched deep, an eagle crowned in flame, surrounded by runes older than Verathorn itself. The taller guard leaned in. His face paled. "I need to fetch the commander." He vanished into the lines, leaving me standing there, stone in hand, the cold morning wind cutting through the holes in my cloak. I barely noticed. Everything ached. It wasn't long before the commander arrived, General Rendell, a mountain of a man clad in armor dark as riverstone. His beard was streaked with frost, and his gaze was sharp enough to cleave through lies before they touched the air. He approached slowly, flanked by 2 officers and a mage whose robes shimmered with protective wards. "You're the one who claims to bear the king's will," Rendell said. I nodded, too tired to speak. I held out the stone. He took it, hands surprisingly gentle for their size, and turned it over in his palms. When the seal flared in his grip, the mage gasped. "That's a true mark," she said. "Royal binding, blood forged." Rendell studied the runes for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "You came through the North Pass." I shook my head. "The Dreadwood, the Mistfen, the mines." The mage stared. "Alone?" "Not at first," I whispered. "Aldrich held the line. He told me to run." Rendell said nothing. He passed the stone to his mage, who scanned it with a touch of her fingers. Her eyes fluttered, then widened. "It's clear," she said. "A royal command. Melgor has summoned Ashwing. The siege must be lifted at once." The officers around her stirred, voices rising, disbelief, confusion, denial. "A dragon? Impossible. This has to be a trick. We've breached the outer wall. We're hours from victory." I stepped forward. My voice was raw, but it didn't shake. I saw it, in the clouds above the valley, wings the size of battlements, fire trailing from its mouth, like a river turned to smoke. They kept arguing. I didn't shout to stop them. I waited. When I spoke again, they listened. "Sir Aldrich is dead. I buried him beneath the stone halls of Myrnos. He gave his life, so I could bring this warning. And you'll waste it if you keep pretending this siege is a battle you can win." They fell silent. Rendell watched me for a long time. Then he nodded. "We strike the camp," he said. "Start pulling the siege towers back. Dismantle what you can. Burn the rest." The officers moved, some still muttering, but they obeyed. The general turned to me once more. "You've done more than many knights would have. You carried the realm on your back, and crossed through fire and shadow to bring us this message." I didn't feel like a knight. I didn't feel like anything. Only a boy who had seen too much. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Rest. Eat. When the sun rises, we move." I watched the camp come alive in a different kind of fury. Orders shouted, tents pulled down, carts loaded, fires lit beneath siege engines too large to take. Behind it all, the spires of Black Spire loomed still and silent, and above them, Ashwing's shape curled through the clouds like a wound in the sky. But now we were moving. Now we had a chance, and I would see it through to the end. The morning broke red, not the soft warmth of sunrise, but the bleeding hue of fire catching the edge of the sky. I stood near the ridge, overlooking the valley, a steaming bowl of broth, untouched in my hands. Below, the camp boiled with motion, tents stripped down to canvas, supply wagons rolling out by the dozens, command banners pulled and lowered. Men shouted over the groan of wooden wheels and the thudding of hooves, each one a voice thrown into the rising storm. Armor clanked, spells shimmered faintly in the early light, cast by exhausted mages to protect the rear columns. Everything moved fast, yet still not fast enough. The runestone decree had broken through their doubt. The command was clear: withdraw, retreat, before fire rained down. Descended, but orders didn't empty a battlefield overnight. There were thousands here, tents, weapons, wounded, whole battalions, still positioned in siege trenches or hidden beneath canvas, lean to be moved. And above it all, Black Spire stood blacker than ever, its walls glinting faintly in the light. The necromancer's fortress remained untouched. For now, I thought the silence was mercy. Then I heard the roar. It rolled across the valley like a thunderclap, cracking stone and shaking the bones in my chest. Not the roar of a beast, but of something more ancient, a sound carved from the first fires of the world. I dropped the bowl. It clattered off a rock and spilled into the dirt. All across the valley, heads turned skyward, the clouds parted, Ashwing descended, wings vast as temple roofs unfolded from the storm. Its body was long, coiled with molten scales that shimmered like obsidian streaked with lava. Its eyes were furnaces, endless and hollow, burning through the sky as it swept downward in a great arc over the cliffs. Its tail lashed behind it like a whip of fire, leaving ribbons of smoke curling in the wind. A hush fell, for just a heartbeat. No one moved. Then the screaming started. The dragon opened its mouth, and light poured forth. Fire, pure and white, surged from its jaws, not the clumsy orange blaze of mortal flame, but a river of heat that melted stone and snapped trees into cinders. Black Spire caught the first breath. The top of the keep vanished in a burst of light, the towers collapsing inward as flame punched through the battlements. Like a hammer, walls turned to molten slag, stone screamed. I watched it fall, staggered back as ash rose like a storm cloud from the heart of the fortress. The army panicked, formations broke, wagons overturned. Some ran blindly, others stood frozen. Officers shouted, trying to restore order, but their voices were nothing against the sky's fury. I saw the eastern trench still manned, a battalion stationed there to hold the ridge in case of a counterattack. Most hadn't even begun moving. A few stood, weapons raised, too far to hear the new commands. I ran. My legs were lead. My body screamed with every step, but I ran anyway, down the slope, through the chaos of the disassembling camp, past horses bucking and carts tangled in their own harnesses. I found them, 50 men, maybe more. Most were fresh recruits, too young to be here. Several wounded lay on stretchers in the back of a wagon, eyes wide with fear. A healer knelt beside them, chanting something I didn't recognize. Ashwing wheeled overhead, its shadow blotting out the sun. I didn't think. I reached for the pendant beneath my tunic, the small crystal Aldrich once gave me. In a moment, I'd long since thought forgotten. He told me its light was old, tied to the wards of the first flame, a last resort, something I had never learned to wield properly. But I remembered his words. The light is memory. The light is truth. It listens to those who stand, not those who run. I held it high and spoke the words he taught me, not loud, just enough for it to hear. The crystal pulsed once, then again, and then it flared. A dome of pale gold shimmered around us, fragile and thin, like the skin of a soap bubble, but it held. Ashwing's flames slammed down on the valley. I saw trees vanish. I saw siege towers burst like candles. I saw men running and falling, shadows fleeing across the stone. That the fire passed over us, the ward holding just long enough, just strong enough to keep the worst at bay. The shield cracked at the edges. The light dimmed, but it held. When the flame passed, the world was silent. Ashwing rose again, wings beating once, twice, dragging smoke and ash into the air. It vanished into the clouds, its roar fading like thunder rolling through mountains far away. I dropped the crystal. It was black now, spent. The men around me stared in awe. The wounded still breathed. The commander of the battalion came forward slowly, his face covered in soot. He saluted me without a word. Then the horns blew, and we resumed the retreat. Black Spire was gone, a ruin, the cliffs around it scorched and broken, but the army lived. Not all of it, not enough, but more than would have if we hadn't warned them, more than none. I walked alone, as the sun set, my boots crunching through ash, the last of the day fading into the smoke-stained sky. My hands were black with soot, my limbs felt like stone, but my heart was steady. I had made it. I had done what I was meant to do. The halls of the capital had never been so quiet. I remembered them differently, filled with banners fluttering high above polished stone, golden light streaming through tall windows, the music of court mages playing faintly, while nobles drifted between chambers like smoke. That memory belonged to another boy, one who had arrived at the foot of the citadel years ago, fresh-faced, his boots too big, his dreams too clean. Now I walked those same halls covered in ash. No fanfare greeted me, no horns, no grand announcement, just the slow, echoing sound of my steps across the marble as I carried what was left of Aldrich's sword. The blade was shattered, broken at the midpoint, where stone and time had finally claimed it. Its edge was blackened, the runes along the fuller were scorched, but I held it carefully, with both hands, like it might still burn. Guards in royal livery flanked the inner hall, their faces solemn as I passed. I could feel their eyes on me, some filled with quiet recognition, others simply unsure what I was. Squire, soldier, survivor. When I reached the throne, I stopped. The king sat beneath the great silver crest of Varathorn, cloaked in steel and shadow. He was not as old as I'd imagined, but he wore his burden like a crown heavier than gold. His hands were folded, his expression unreadable, carved in the still patience of those who know their choices send ripples through the world. I said nothing. I knelt, and I placed Aldrich's sword on the first step of the dais. Its broken edge faced outward, its hilt pointed toward the throne, a gesture older than the kingdom itself, not of surrender, not of pride, of sacrifice. The silence held. Then the king rose, slowly. His boots clicked softly on the stone as he descended one step, then another, until he stood before me, not as a sovereign, but as a man looking into the face of what war makes. He said only 2 words, "Rise, knight." I stood, a squire no longer. The days that followed blurred. Rest came in pieces. My sleep was dreamless. The healers tended to my wounds, the smiths to my armor. They reforged it in the fires beneath the bastion forge, plates of burnished steel, trimmed in black, the crest of Duskmoor etched across the chest. They offered me a new sword. I declined. Instead, I carried Aldrich's hilt, the shattered blade wrapped in leather, the pommel still heavy with its old weight. I would bear it until I earned a blade of my own. Messengers brought word from the south. Ashwing had returned to the mountains. For now, Malgor was gone, his fortress buried beneath its own ruin. But the dragon remained, alive and watching. Smoke still curled from distant hills, and whispers spread like wildfire of other powers stirring, of shadows waking in places long thought dead. There would be no peace, not yet, but something had changed. Men spoke my name now with respect. The army knew what I had done, how I had crossed cursed forests, sunken swamps, dead kingdoms, how I had walked through fire and shadow and brought the warning that saved them. They called me Calum of the Flame. I didn't feel like a hero. I still remembered the mines, the screams, the weight of the torch burning low in my hand, while the stone closed in around me. I remembered Aldrich's voice, his calm, his eyes. Your oath was not to follow me. It was to serve the realm. And so I had. Now I stood atop the outer wall of the capital, the wind pulling at my cloak, the sky clearing in streaks of orange and steel. Far in the distance, I saw the outline of the mountains. Black Spire's bones still smoldered somewhere beyond them. Ashwing still flew, but I didn't turn away. I placed my hand on the hilt of my sword. What remained of it? Armor whole, spirit tempered, gaze fixed forward. There would be more battles, more shadows to walk through. But I had learned what Aldrich always knew. Courage isn't loud. It isn't light. It's a fire you carry, when the night is deepest, and I would carry it still,